You ever hear a lock being cut in the middle of the night and know, right away, it's not an accident? That sound woke me before I even opened my eyes. A clean, deliberate snap. Metal under pressure. Then again. Slower this time. Controlled. I checked the clock. 2:17 a.m. And I didn't need to look outside to understand what was happening. Someone was on my property. At my root cellar. I didn't rush. Didn't grab a phone. Didn't call out. I just sat there for a moment, listening. Because when you've lived somewhere long enough, you know the difference between noise and intent. I got up. Floorboards cool under my feet. Every step quiet. Familiar. By the time I reached the back door, I wasn't wondering if someone was breaking in. I was deciding how much I wanted to see before I stepped in. The night air was heavy when I cracked the door. Damp soil. Cut grass. And underneath it, effort. Someone working. I moved along the side of the house, staying in the shadows. The cellar sat where it always had. Half buried. Solid. Untouched for decades. My father built that door. Late 70s. Steel hinges. Reinforced frame. The kind of work that doesn't fail unless someone forces it to. Which is why the moment I saw her, I stopped. Diane Whitmore. HOA board member. The woman who liked to remind everyone what was acceptable around here. And there she was, kneeling in my yard, with a pair of bolt cutters pressed against my lock. I didn't say a word. Just watched. Because the chain told me something she didn't realize. Those weren't fresh marks. She'd been here before. Trying. Testing. And tonight, she thought she'd finally get away with it. The cutters came down again. Snap. She paused. Looked over her shoulder. Checking the dark. Like this place stopped belonging to me after midnight. That's when it settled in. Not anger. Not surprise. Just clarity. She believed she had the right. That nobody would challenge her. That whatever was behind that door was hers to inspect. The chain dropped. She reached for the handle. Confident. Certain. Like she'd already won. I stepped forward just enough for the light to catch me. Not to scare her. Just to make one thing clear. She wasn't alone anymore. She lifted the door a few inches. Then hesitated. For the first time. Because something about that darkness below felt different now. Heavier. Like it wasn't just a cellar anymore. I didn't say a word. Didn't need to. Because the truth is, by the time she showed up with those bolt cutters, this stopped being about a lock. Or a cellar. Or HOA rules. She just didn't know it yet. So let me ask you. If someone crossed onto your land at 2 a.m., cut your lock, and acted like they had every right, would you stop them? Or would you let them go just far enough to make sure they never tried it again? I did not move when she disappeared into the cellar. Not right away. Because there was a certain kind of silence that followed her, heavier than before, like the ground itself was holding its breath, and I stood there just outside the reach of the light, listening to the faint creak of the old hinges settling and the soft thud of her boots hitting the packed dirt below. And for a moment, it almost felt like I was back there again, years ago, standing beside my father as he lowered the first crate of mason jars down those same steps. The smell of fresh-cut lumber mixing with the cool, damp air rising from the earth. My name is Ethan Cole, 38 years old, and I have lived on this land my entire life. Not because I never left, but because no matter where I went, I always came back. My grandfather bought these 12 acres in 1959, back when this county was more farmland than subdivision, and he built the first structure here with his own hands, a small wooden house that still stands behind me, weathered but solid, like everything he ever made. My father expanded it, added the workshop, the fence line, and eventually that cellar, digging it out one summer with a rented backhoe and more stubbornness than sense, because he believed in storing things the right way, believed in doing things yourself, and believed that what you built with your own hands meant something different. I learned that early, long before I ever understood what an HOA even was. Long before people like Diane Whitmore started talking about property values like they were the only thing that mattered. When the subdivision went up across the road 8 years ago, they brought with them paved streets, matching mailboxes, and a board that seemed to think everything outside their lines was a problem waiting to be fixed, and Diane quickly became the face of that, always dressed like she was heading to a meeting that nobody else was invited to. Always holding a clipboard or a folder like it gave her authority over things she did not understand. At first, it was small things, comments about my fence needing to be replaced, suggestions that the old shed did not match the neighborhood aesthetic, polite on the surface but sharp underneath, like she was testing how far she could push before someone pushed back. I kept it simple, showed her the property lines, reminded her that my land was not part of their association, and for a while that was enough, at least on paper. But people like Diane do not stop when they are told no, they just change the angle. And over the past year her attention shifted to the cellar, calling it a safety concern, then an unregistered structure, then hinting that she had reason to believe I was using it for something that did not comply with county regulations, each claim more stretched than the last, but always delivered with that same calm certainty, like she expected repetition to turn fiction into fact. I remember the first time she stood at the edge of that hill, looking down at the door with that expression, not curiosity, not concern, but ownership, like she had already decided it should not be there, and I knew then that she was not going to let it go. So I did what I always do when something does not feel right. I paid attention, I checked the locks more often, I started noticing small things, scuff marks where there should not be any, the chain sitting just a little different than I left it, details most people would ignore, but that stood out to me like a loose board in a straight wall. And now here she was, inside that space, after weeks of circling it like a problem she wanted to solve, and I could not help but think about how far she had already crossed the line without even realizing it. Because whatever she believed she was about to find down there, she had no idea what she had just stepped into. I could hear her moving around down there now, slow at first, like she was letting her eyes adjust to the dark, then a little faster as she got her bearings, and I pictured exactly what she was seeing, because I had seen it 1,000 times myself. The narrow steps cut into the packed dirt, the wooden shelves lining the walls, rows of glass jars catching what little light filtered in from the doorway above, each one labeled in my father's handwriting, still clear after all these years, and I wondered what she thought she was going to find that justified breaking a lock in the middle of the night. Diane Whitmore had always carried herself like she was one step ahead of everyone else, like she had already solved a problem nobody else even knew existed. And that confidence had only grown after she became vice president of the Homeowners Association across the road, a position she treated less like a volunteer role and more like a title she had earned through some higher authority. She drove a white SUV that was always spotless, parked perfectly centered in her driveway, and she walked the neighborhood like she was conducting inspections, stopping to take pictures of things that did not meet her standards, sending out notices that read like polite warnings but felt like ultimatums. And people either complied or found themselves buried under paperwork that made it easier to give and then push back. But my property had never been part of her system, never signed into those bylaws or subject to those rules, and that seemed to bother her more than anything else, the idea that there was a piece of land she could see but not control. The first time she mentioned the cellar, she framed it as concern, standing just far enough back to avoid stepping onto my property while still pointing directly at the door, asking if I had it inspected, if it met county codes, if it posed any risk to surrounding properties, questions that sounded reasonable until you realized none of them applied to her. And I answered them the same way every time, calm, direct, and backed by documentation, permits filed decades ago, maintenance records, everything in order. That should have been the end of it. But instead it became the beginning of something else, something quieter and more persistent, like she had decided. The official route was not going to get her what she wanted, so she would find another way. Over the past few months, neighbors had started repeating things they claimed they heard from her, that I was storing chemicals down there, that I might be running some kind of unregistered operation. Nothing specific enough to be challenged directly, but just enough to plant doubt. And I recognized the pattern because I had seen it before in smaller ways. The way she built narratives piece by piece until they felt real to the people hearing them. I did not confront her about it. Not then, because reacting too early would have only given her something to work with. And instead I watched, I listened, and I started preparing in ways she could not see, making sure every lock was secure, every angle of that cellar covered, every detail accounted for. Because if there was one thing I knew about people like Diane, it was that they believed their own assumptions enough to act on them. Now she was down there, moving through a space she had no right to enter. And I could hear the faint clink of glass as she brushed past the shelves, the soft scrape of her shoes on the dirt floor, and then a pause, longer than the others, like she had found something that made her stop and take a closer look, and I stayed exactly where I was, just outside the door, listening, waiting, because whatever she thought she had discovered, it was about to matter more than she expected. The pause stretched just long enough for the night sounds to creep back in around it, crickets in the distance, the faint hum of power lines beyond the tree line. And then I heard it, a quiet intake of breath from down below, not fear exactly, but something close to it, like the confidence she walked in with had just shifted into something more uncertain, and I knew that feeling because I had planned for it. The cellar was not complicated, but it was deliberate, every shelf placed where it made sense, every crate labeled, every jar sealed, and stored the way my father taught me. But over the past few weeks I had made a few additions, nothing dramatic, nothing that would stand out to someone just glancing around, just small things that only mattered if you were paying attention, and Diane was the kind of person who always believed she was paying attention. I could hear her moving again, slower now, more careful, the faint clink of glass followed by the soft scrape of something being set back in place, like she was trying to make sure nothing looked disturbed, and that alone told me more than anything else could have, because people who believe they are doing the right thing do not usually worry about leaving a trace. I stepped a little closer to the door, just enough to see the faint glow of her phone light reflecting off the inside walls, a narrow beam cutting through the darkness as she moved it from one shelf to the next, and for a second it illuminated the far corner where the older storage crates sat, the ones we had not used in years but never threw away, and I saw her stop there, the light steady now, focused, like she had found something that fit whatever story she had built in her head. The air coming up from the cellar carried that familiar coolness, mixed now with a sharper edge, the scent of disturbed earth and old wood shifting as she moved things around that had not been touched in a while, and it reminded me how easily a space like that could feel different depending on who was standing in it, how the same room could feel like home to one person and something else entirely to another. Diane had spent months convincing herself there was something wrong down there, something hidden, something that justified all the letters and complaints and quiet rumors, and now she was standing inside it, trying to make that belief real, trying to find something she could point to and say she had been right all along. I reached for the edge of the cellar door, my hand resting lightly against the worn wood, feeling the grooves and marks left by years of use. And I thought about how many times I had opened and closed it without a second thought, how routine it had always been, and how different it felt now with her inside. There was a sound from below, a faint shift, followed by the creak of one of the lower boards, and then another pause, longer this time, like she was reading something, or trying to understand what she was looking at, and I realized she had reached the back section, the part most people would not even notice unless they knew where to look. I did not rush, did not interrupt, because this was the moment everything hinged on, not the break-in, not the rumors, but this exact point where her assumptions met something real, something she could not easily explain away. The night air felt cooler now, or maybe that was just the adrenaline settling into something steadier, something focused, and I tightened my grip on the door just slightly, not enough to make a sound, just enough to remind myself that I was still in control of what happened next. Below me, the beam of her phone light shifted again, slower than before, tracing along the back wall, and I could almost picture the expression on her face without even seeing it, the certainty starting to crack, replaced by something else she had not planned for. And that was when I knew she had finally noticed the one thing she was never supposed to see. The silence that followed stretched tighter than anything before it, not empty but loaded, like the air itself was waiting to see what she would do next, and then I heard it, a small, involuntary shift in her breathing, sharper now, less controlled, followed by the faint rustle of paper or cardboard being moved aside, and I knew exactly what she had found because I had placed it there myself weeks ago, not as bait in the obvious sense, but as something that would only matter to someone already, looking for a reason to be there. Diane had spent months building a narrative around that cellar, convincing herself and anyone who would listen that something was off, that there was more going on beneath that door than simple storage, and now she was standing in the one spot where that narrative collided with something real enough to make her hesitate. I could hear her footsteps shift again, a slight repositioning on the packed dirt floor, and then the soft tap of her phone as she adjusted the light, angling it closer, focusing, trying to make sense of what she was seeing, and for the first time since she started this, there was no movement for several seconds, just stillness, like she had reached a point she had not fully thought through. The beam of light flickered slightly against the back wall, catching on edges that were never meant to be obvious, outlines that blended into the structure unless you knew how to read them, and I imagined her narrowing her eyes, leaning in, trying to interpret something that did not fit neatly into the story she had prepared. That was always the risk when someone went looking for proof instead of truth. They did not recognize it when it looked different than expected. The cool air rising from the cellar carried a faint change now. The subtle disturbance of objects moved out of place, the smell of old wood and paper shifting as her presence altered the balance of a space that had been left alone for years, and it made the moment feel heavier, more deliberate, like something irreversible had already happened even though nothing visible had changed yet. I stayed where I was, just outside, letting the scene play out without interruption, because timing mattered more than anything else now, not rushing in, not reacting too soon, but letting her fully commit to whatever conclusion she was reaching down there. I heard her take another step, slower this time, followed by the soft creak of a shelf under slight pressure, and then a quiet exhale, longer than before, like she had just confirmed something in her mind, something that justified everything she had done to get to this point. That was the moment I had been waiting for, not the break-in, not the rumors, but this exact shift from uncertainty to belief, because once someone crossed that line, they did not turn back. They moved forward with confidence, and confidence made people careless. The night around me felt still, the kind of stillness that makes even the smallest sound stand out, and I adjusted my stance slightly, my hand still resting against the edge of the door, feeling the weight of it, the way it could move with almost no effort if you knew how to handle it. Below, the light shifted again, tracing along the back corner, lingering now, and I could almost picture her expression settling into something certain, something satisfied, like she had finally found what she had been looking for all along. That certainty was exactly what I needed, because whatever she thought she had just discovered, she was about to act on it. I heard it in the way she moved next, not cautious anymore, not testing, but purposeful, like she had just crossed some internal line that told her she was right, and that shift changed everything about the way she handled the space. The light from her phone no longer drifting, but locking onto specific points, her footsteps more direct, less hesitant, as if she had finally found the confirmation she came for. That was always the pattern with Diane. She did not need facts. She needed validation, something she could hold on to and present as proof, even if it only made sense to her. And once she had that, she acted fast, moving to secure whatever advantage she thought she had uncovered. I could hear her reaching for something now, the faint scrape of wood against wood as one of the crates shifted slightly, followed by the soft thud of it being set back down, and then the unmistakable sound of a phone camera activating, a quick digital click in the quiet dark, and I knew she was documenting it, building her case in real time, already imagining the emails, the complaints, the official tone she would use when she brought this to the board or the county. The idea that she had found something wrong down there must have felt like a victory to her, like all those weeks of circling the issue had finally paid off. And for a brief second, I almost understood the satisfaction she was chasing, the sense of control that came from believing you had uncovered something hidden. But that was the difference between us. She was chasing a conclusion, and I had been preparing for one. The night air felt heavier now, the quiet pressing in around the edges of the moment, and I shifted my weight slightly, testing the door again without moving it, feeling how easily it would swing if I chose to. How simple the motion was compared to everything that had led up to it. Below me, Diane moved again, faster this time, like she was trying to gather as much as she could before anyone noticed, her breathing just a little louder, the controlled rhythm starting to slip as urgency took over, and I could hear her stepping back toward the stairs, the beam of light rising slightly as she turned. Probably planning her next move, already thinking about how she would present what she believed she had found. She had no idea that every step she had taken down there, every movement, every photograph, had already been accounted for long before tonight. I let a few seconds pass, just enough for her to commit fully to leaving, to carry that certainty with her, and then I moved. Not quickly, not dramatically, just a steady shift forward as my hand closed firmly around the edge of the cellar door. The wood felt solid, familiar, grounding in a way that cut through everything else. And for a brief moment I thought about how many times this door had been opened and closed without consequence, how ordinary it had always been, and how different this one action was about to make it. I pulled the door up just enough to feel its weight shift, then guided it back down, controlled, deliberate, until it met the frame with a muted, final sound that carried down into the space below, not loud, but unmistakable. The reaction was immediate, a sudden stop in her movement, the light freezing in place for a split second before shifting rapidly, and then her voice, sharper than before, calling out into the darkness above, asking who was there, demanding an answer she was not going to get right away. I did not respond, not yet, because the moment was not about what I said. It was about what she understood, and understanding takes a second longer when it is not what you expect. I reached for the latch, the same one she had just cut through from the outside, and secured it in place with a calm, practiced motion, the metal settling into position with a soft, decisive click that echoed faintly down the steps. Below me, her voice changed again, the certainty gone now, replaced with something tighter, something edged with realization as she stepped toward the stairs and found something different than what she had left behind. That was when the balance finally shifted. For a second there was nothing but the sound of her breathing from below, sharper now, uneven in a way that told me the shift had landed exactly how I expected, and then her footsteps moved quickly toward the stairs, dirt shifting under her weight as she climbed halfway up before stopping short, just out of sight but close enough that I could hear her hand hit the underside of the door, testing it, pushing once, then again, harder this time, and when it did not move the way it had before, there was a pause that felt heavier than anything else that night. "Ethan," she called up, her voice trying to hold on to that same authority she always used during the day. But there was something underneath it now, something tighter, less certain, and I did not answer right away, not because I had nothing to say, but because silence was doing more work than words ever could in that moment. The latch held steady under my hand, the metal cool and solid, and I could feel the faint vibration of her pushing from below, testing it again, this time with more urgency, like she expected resistance, but not this kind of finality. "This is not appropriate," she said, louder now, the words coming faster, as if saying them would restore control. "You cannot just trap someone like this." And I almost smiled at that, not out of humor, but at the way she framed it, like this situation had started here, like the line had not already been crossed long before I ever touched that door. I shifted slightly, leaning just enough to look down through the narrow gap where the wood met the frame, catching a glimpse of her face in the reflected light from her phone, her expression pulled tight between frustration and something she had not quite named yet, and I spoke then, calm, even, the same tone I had used every time she stood at the edge of my property telling me what I should do with it. "You broke into my cellar," I said, not loud, not aggressive, just clear, letting the words sit where they needed to, and for a second she did not respond, like she was deciding how to argue with something that simple. "I was inspecting a potential hazard," she shot back, quick, automatic, the explanation already prepared, and that was the part that confirmed everything for me. Because she did not deny being there, she justified it, which meant she believed it. I let a few seconds pass, the night stretching around us, and then I added, "You cut the lock," and this time there was a longer pause, followed by the faint scrape of her shifting her stance below, like she was recalibrating, looking for a different angle. "This property affects the community," she said, her voice rising slightly, reaching for that same authority she always leaned on. "I have a responsibility to ensure compliance." And I could hear the echo of every conversation we had ever had in that tone, the assumption that saying something enough times made it true. But there was a difference now, because she was not standing on the other side of a property line with daylight and distance between us. She was below ground, inside a space she had no right to enter, and for the first time, the rules she relied on did not apply the way she expected them to. I stepped back from the door just slightly, enough to give myself space, and reached into my pocket, pulling out my phone, the screen lighting up the darkness around me in a soft glow that felt almost out of place compared to everything else. I did not rush, did not make a show of it, just scrolled to the number I had already saved, the one I had hoped I would not need but had prepared anyway, and as it began to ring, I could hear her below, still talking, still trying to reframe what was happening into something she could control, her words coming faster now, layered with a kind of urgency that had not been there before. I held the phone to my ear, listening as the line connected, and looked down at the door, at the simple piece of wood that had become the dividing line between two completely different understandings of the same moment. "County Dispatch." A voice answered on the other end, steady and routine, and I spoke just as calmly, giving my name, my address, and a brief explanation of the situation, keeping it factual, clear, exactly the way it needed to be. Below me, Diane's voice faltered slightly when she realized what I was doing, the shift subtle but unmistakable, and for the first time since she stepped onto my property, she stopped trying to control the narrative and started reacting to it. And that was when everything began to change in a way she could not undo. The dispatcher's voice stayed calm on the line, asking for details, confirming the address, the kind of steady, procedural tone that did not change no matter what situation it was applied to, and I answered the same way, keeping everything simple, clear, and factual, because the more straightforward something is, the harder it is to twist into something else later. Below me, Diane went quiet for a few seconds after she realized who I was speaking to, and that silence felt different than before, less controlled, more calculated, like she was shifting from reaction back into strategy, trying to find a version of this that still worked in her favor. I could hear her moving again, slower now, more deliberate, the faint sound of her shoes against the dirt floor as she stepped back from the stairs, creating space, like she needed room to think. "Ethan, we can handle this without involving anyone else," she said, her voice measured again, trying to regain that familiar tone of authority, but there was an edge to it now, something that had not been there before, and I did not respond right away, letting the dispatcher continue asking questions while Diane adjusted her approach below. I described what had happened in the same order it occurred, the damaged lock, the unauthorized entry, her presence inside the cellar, and I could almost feel the weight of each word settling into place, forming a sequence that did not leave much room for interpretation. The dispatcher acknowledged it, asked if anyone was injured, if there was any immediate danger, and I answered no, because there was not, just a situation that had already crossed into something else. Below, Diane tried again, her voice softer this time, more conversational, like she was attempting to reset the dynamic. "You do not understand how these things work," she said. "There are regulations, liabilities. If something happens on your property, it affects everyone." And I could hear the shift in her wording, moving away from accusation and toward explanation, as if reframing the situation could still pull it back into her control. But the moment she cut that lock, that framework stopped applying the way she thought it did. I thanked the dispatcher, confirmed that someone was on the way, and ended the call, the screen going dark as I slipped the phone back into my pocket, the night returning to its natural quiet except for the presence of the situation unfolding beneath my feet. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke, and that silence carried more weight than anything else, because now there was nothing left to negotiate, no misunderstanding to clear up, just a series of actions that had already been set in motion. Diane broke it first. "You are making a mistake," she said, the words coming slower now, more deliberate, like she had chosen them carefully. "This does not need to go any further." And I could hear the underlying shift, the realization that whatever she had planned to do with what she found down there was no longer the only outcome. I stepped closer to the door again, not enough to open it, just enough to be present, and looked down through that same narrow gap, catching the reflection of her face again in the dim light. And this time the certainty was gone, replaced by something else, something more cautious. "It already did," I said, keeping my voice even, because raising it would not change anything now. And for a moment she did not respond, like she was weighing her options, looking for a path that had not already closed. The faint red glow of my porch light reached just far enough to touch the edge of the cellar door, casting a soft line across the wood, and I noticed how still everything else felt, like the entire scene had narrowed down to this one point, this one decision that had already been made whether either of us acknowledged it or not. In the distance, I thought I heard something faint, not close yet, but enough to register, a sound that did not belong to the usual rhythm of the night, and I saw her react to it too, her head turning slightly, her attention shifting upward for just a second before settling back into the space around her. That was when I realized she had finally understood what was coming next. The faint sound grew clearer now, still distant but unmistakable once you knew what to listen for. The low hum of an engine moving steadily along the county road, cutting through the quiet in a way that did not belong to the night, and I saw the exact moment it registered for Diane. The way her posture shifted, her shoulders tightening slightly as she turned toward the direction of the sound, even though she could not see anything from where she stood. She knew what it meant, not because I had said it, but because she had heard that same sound before in a different context, one where she was standing safely outside of a situation, observing it, managing it, not inside it with no control over how it would unfold. Below me, her breathing slowed again, but it was not the same controlled rhythm from earlier. It was measured in a different way now, deliberate, like she was trying to stay composed while recalculating everything at once. "Ethan," she said again, quieter this time, less force behind it, more intent, like she was aiming for reason instead of authority. "This can still be resolved." And I could hear the shift in her approach, the move from insisting to negotiating, a change that would have seemed reasonable if it had come before she cut through a lock on someone else's property. I did not answer right away, letting the sound of the approaching vehicle fill the space between us, because sometimes the absence of a response says more than anything else could. The cellar door remained steady under my hand, the latch secure, and I could feel the faint movement from below as she adjusted her position again, stepping back from the stairs, creating distance, like she was trying to find a place in that space where she could regain some sense of control. The beam of her phone light shifted upward briefly, catching the underside of the door, tracing along the wood and metal, and I wondered if she was seeing it differently now, not as something to open, but as something that defined the boundary she could not cross anymore. The engine sound grew louder, closer, tires moving over gravel somewhere beyond the tree line, and the night air seemed to carry it more clearly now, bouncing it off the open space in a way that made it feel nearer than it actually was. Diane spoke again, faster this time, like she was running out of time to frame this on her terms. "You do not have to do this," she said, the words coming in a rush that broke her usual cadence. "We can clarify what I found. There are procedures, documentation. You are putting yourself at risk by escalating this." And that last part lingered just a little longer, like she was trying to shift the focus back onto me, to make it seem like I was the one stepping outside of something reasonable. I leaned slightly closer to the door, enough for my voice to carry clearly without raising it, and said, "You already escalated it," letting the statement sit there without adding anything else, because there was nothing else needed. For a moment, she did not respond, and in that silence I could hear the engine again, closer now, followed by the faint crunch of tires turning off the main road, moving onto the gravel path that led toward my property, a sound that was familiar in a different way, routine but out of place at this hour. Diane's phone light dipped slightly, her attention splitting between the space around her and the realization settling in, and I could almost feel the shift in her understanding, the point where this stopped being something she could talk her way out of and became something she had to face. The air felt cooler now, or maybe that was just the tension finally settling into something steady, something resolved, and I stepped back from the door just enough to give myself space as the sound of the approaching vehicle grew louder, the headlights still hidden by the trees, but close enough to cast a faint glow through the branches. Below, Diane moved again, slower this time, no longer searching, no longer documenting, just waiting, and that was the biggest change of all, because for the first time since she stepped onto my property, she had stopped trying to control what happened next. The headlights appeared first, cutting through the trees in slow, sweeping arcs of pale white. Then the engine settled into a lower idle as the vehicle turned fully onto my gravel path, tires crunching in a steady rhythm that echoed louder than it should have in the stillness of the night. And I watched as the beams stretched across the edge of the yard, catching the fence posts, the side of the house, and finally the slope where I stood, casting long shadows that shifted as the vehicle came to a gradual stop. I stepped back from the cellar door just enough to give the space a clear line of sight, not moving quickly, not signaling anything beyond what was already obvious, and the engine cut off a second later, leaving the air filled with that brief mechanical ticking that follows, metal cooling down after motion. For a moment, nothing else happened, just the faint glow of headlights and the quiet settling of the night around them. And then the driver's side door opened with a solid click, followed by the sound of boots hitting gravel, deliberate, unhurried steps moving toward the yard. I could hear Diane shift below me again, her movement quieter now, more contained, like she was trying not to draw attention even though she already knew it was too late for that. And I did not look down this time, keeping my focus on the approaching figure as it came into clearer view under the porch light. Deputy Harris had been out here before, not often, but enough to recognize the place without hesitation, a tall man with a steady posture and the kind of expression that did not change much regardless of the situation, and he gave a short nod as he approached, his eyes taking in the scene quickly, the broken lock on the ground, the closed cellar door, and then me. "Evening, Ethan," he said, calm, routine, like this was just another call on a long shift, and I nodded back, keeping it simple. "She is inside," I said, gesturing slightly toward the door, not adding anything more than necessary, because everything else would speak for itself. There was a brief pause as he processed that, his gaze shifting to the cellar, and then he stepped closer, his boots crunching lightly on the gravel as he moved into position just beside me. "Ma'am," he called down, his voice carrying clearly through the wood, firm but not raised. "This is the county sheriff's office." And the response came almost immediately from below, Diane's voice tighter now, controlled but strained at the edges as she answered, identifying herself, explaining that there had been a misunderstanding, that she was conducting an inspection related to community safety, the same narrative she had used before, but now delivered in a space where it did not carry the same weight. Deputy Harris listened without interrupting, his expression unchanged, and then he looked at me briefly, just a quick glance that asked a question without words, and I answered it with a small nod, confirming what he already suspected. He reached for the latch then, testing it lightly, not opening it yet, just confirming that it was secure, and then he spoke again, more directly this time. "Ma'am, I am going to need you to step away from the door and remain where you are," he said, the tone shifting slightly from conversational to procedural, and there was a moment of hesitation from below before Diane responded, her voice lower now, less certain, acknowledging the instruction. The deputy waited a beat, listening, making sure she complied, and then he turned his attention back to the door, his hand resting on the latch, ready to open it, but not rushing the motion, because even something simple like that had a process when it reached this point. The night felt still again, but different than before, no longer tense with uncertainty, but settled into something more defined, like the outcome had already begun to take shape even before the door was opened. I stood where I was, just off to the side, letting the situation move forward without stepping into it any more than I already had, because this part was no longer mine to control. Below, Diane did not speak again, and for the first time since all of this started, there was nothing left for her to say. Deputy Harris did not rush the moment, his hand resting on the latch for a second longer than necessary, not out of hesitation but out of habit, the kind of pause that ensures everything is exactly where it needs to be before the next step happens. And then he lifted it with a steady motion, the metal shifting with a soft click that sounded louder than it should have in the quiet. The door opened slowly, controlled, the hinges giving a low creak as the gap widened, and the beam of his flashlight cut cleanly down into the cellar, replacing the narrow glow of Diane's phone with something broader, sharper, leaving no shadows untouched. I stayed where I was, just off to the side, watching as the scene below came into full view for the first time from above, the shelves, the jars, the crates, all exactly as they had been, except now there was someone standing among them who did not belong there, her posture rigid, her phone still in her hand, the light from it no longer necessary under the deputy's beam. "Ma'am, step toward the stairs slowly," Harris said, his tone even, procedural. Not accusatory, just clear, and Diane complied without argument, moving carefully, her movements measured in a way that suggested she understood exactly how different this situation had become. As she reached the first step, the light followed her, illuminating her face more clearly, and I saw the shift there too. Not panic, not quite, but the absence of that earlier certainty, replaced by something more controlled, more cautious, like she was already thinking ahead to how this would be explained. "There has been a misunderstanding," she began again, her voice steadier now that there was someone else to address, someone she believed might still be influenced by the right framing. "I was conducting a necessary inspection regarding a potential hazard affecting neighboring properties," and she gestured slightly behind her, indicating the cellar as if it supported her claim. Harris listened, his expression unchanged, his attention moving briefly over the interior, taking in the details, the intact structure, the organized storage, nothing immediately matching the urgency of her explanation. "Do you have permission to be on this property?" he asked, the question simple, direct, cutting through everything else she had said, and for a second, just a second, she hesitated before answering. "This falls under community oversight," she replied, her voice tightening slightly around the edges. "There are regulations that allow," but he did not let her finish. "Do you have permission from the property owner to be inside this structure?" he repeated, the same calm tone, but more precise now, narrowing the focus to exactly what mattered, and this time there was no immediate response, just a brief silence that said more than anything else could have. I watched as she reached the top of the stairs, stepping up into the open air, the difference between inside and outside visible in the way she adjusted, her shoulders straightening slightly, her posture resetting as if being above ground restored something she had lost. Harris stepped back just enough to give her space, but his position remained firm, between her and the path leading away from the cellar, not aggressive, just present, and that presence alone shifted the balance completely. "I need you to place your phone down on the ground for a moment," he said, again procedural, again without escalation, and she complied, setting it carefully on the gravel, the small device suddenly looking out of place in the larger context of everything happening. The broken lock lay nearby, the cut chain still attached, and Harris glanced at it briefly before looking back at her. "Can you explain how this lock was damaged?" he asked, and the question hung there, simple but unavoidable, connecting the physical evidence to the situation in a way that could not be redirected. Diane opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again, her expression tightening as she searched for an answer that fit, something that aligned with the narrative she had built, but the pieces did not connect the way they had before. The night remained quiet around us, the only sounds the faint hum of the patrol car and the distant rustle of trees, and in that stillness, the gap between what she had believed and what was actually happening became impossible to ignore. Harris waited, giving her the space to answer, not pushing, not rushing, because the truth has a way of revealing itself when there is nowhere else to go. And for the first time since she stepped onto my property, Diane Whitmore had no version of this that worked in her favor. For a long second, she said nothing, and that silence felt heavier than anything she had said all night, because it was no longer controlled, no longer part of a strategy, it was the absence of one. Deputy Harris did not fill it for her, did not prompt or repeat the question. He simply waited, his posture steady, his attention fixed, allowing the weight of that unanswered moment to settle where it needed to. Diane's eyes flicked briefly toward the broken lock on the ground, then back up to him, and I could see the calculation happening in real time, the search for a version of events that could still hold together under this kind of scrutiny. "The lock was compromised before I arrived," she said finally, her voice measured again, but thinner now, less certain. "I was attempting to assess the situation for community safety, and the explanation sounded familiar, structured in the same way as everything else she had said. But there was a difference now, a gap between the words and the reality sitting right in front of all of us." Harris glanced down at the lock again, then back at her, his expression unchanged, and asked, "Did you report the damaged lock before entering the structure?" And that question landed differently, not confrontational, just precise, narrowing the space she had to move in. She hesitated again, just briefly, and that was enough. "No," she said, the word coming out quieter than the rest, and Harris nodded once, not in agreement, just acknowledgement, like he had reached the point he needed to reach. He shifted slightly, his stance adjusting in a way that signaled the situation had moved from questioning to something more formal, and his voice followed that shift, still calm, but more defined now. "Ma'am, based on what I am seeing and what you have stated, you entered private property without permission and damaged a secured access point to do so," he said, each part of the sentence laid out clearly, without emphasis, without judgment, just a statement of sequence, and for the first time since this began, Diane did not try to interrupt or redirect it. She stood there, shoulders set but no longer rigid, her gaze steady but no longer searching for an angle, and I could see the moment she understood that the framework she had relied on did not apply here the way she thought it did. "I am going to need you to turn around and place your hands behind your back," Harris continued. The words delivered the same way as everything else, procedural, controlled, and she complied without resistance. The movement slow, deliberate, like she was choosing to maintain whatever composure she had left rather than challenge something she could no longer influence. I stayed where I was, watching the scene unfold with a kind of quiet detachment, not because it did not matter, but because this part had already moved beyond me, into a process that did not depend on how I felt about it. The night air felt cooler now, or maybe it was just the tension finally settling into something resolved, something that had a direction instead of uncertainty. Harris guided her a few steps away from the cellar, not forcefully, just enough to create space, and he spoke again, explaining what was happening in the same steady tone, informing her of the situation without escalation, without anything that could be interpreted as more than what it was. Diane listened, her expression controlled, her posture still composed in a way that suggested she was already thinking about what came next, not in this moment, but after it, how it would be explained, how it would be framed, how it would be managed. But even that felt different now, less certain, like she understood that this was not something that could be reshaped as easily as the things she had dealt with before. The porch light cast a steady glow across the yard, illuminating the space where everything had just happened, and for a moment it all felt strangely ordinary again. The cellar door closed, the house quiet, the night continuing on as if nothing had changed, even though everything had. Harris walked her toward the patrol car, the gravel crunching under their steps, and I remained near the cellar, my attention drifting back to the door, to the place where this had started, and how simple it had seemed before tonight. The engine started again, the headlights shifting as the vehicle prepared to leave, and I realized that the outcome was no longer something unfolding. It had already happened. The patrol car disappeared down the gravel path slowly, its taillights shrinking into two faint red dots before vanishing completely behind the trees. And just like that, the night settled back into something familiar, the crickets returning, the air still, the kind of quiet that makes you question if anything actually happened at all. I stood there for a moment longer, looking at the empty space where the headlights had been, letting the stillness settle in fully before turning my attention back to the cellar, to the door that now looked exactly like it always had, closed, solid, unremarkable to anyone who did not know what had just taken place around it. The broken lock still lay on the ground, the chain cut clean through, a small, simple piece of metal that had turned into something far more significant than it was ever meant to be, and I bent down to pick it up, turning it over in my hand, feeling the weight of it, the rough edge where it had been cut, a physical reminder of a line that had been crossed without hesitation. I did not rush to replace it, did not feel the need to fix anything right away, because nothing about what mattered here had actually been broken, not in the way Diane had believed. The cellar itself was unchanged, the shelves intact, the jars undisturbed, everything exactly where it had always been. And that was the part she never understood, that the value of something like this was not in how it looked from the outside or how it fit into someone else's idea of order, but in the fact that it existed the way it was meant to. I stepped closer to the door and rested my hand against the wood again, the same familiar surface, worn smooth in places from years of use. And for a second I thought about my father, about the way he would check the hinges every season, not because they needed it, but because that was what you did when something mattered. You maintained it. You paid attention. You did not wait for someone else to tell you it was worth taking care of. The night air carried that same faint scent of earth and wood, steady and unchanged, and I realized how little of this had actually been about the cellar itself. Diane had not come here because of what was inside. She had come because she believed there was something she had the right to control, something that did not fit into her system, and when she could not shape it from the outside, she tried to force her way in. But control does not work that way. Not on land that was never part of your rules, not on something built long before you arrived and meant to last long after. I set the broken lock down on the edge of the step and reached for the door, lifting it slightly, just enough to feel the familiar motion, then lowering it back into place, the hinges settling with that same low, steady sound, unchanged, unaffected by everything that had just happened. The simplicity of it stood out more now than it ever had before, the idea that something could remain exactly what it was, regardless of how someone else tried to redefine it. I walked back toward the house slowly, the gravel crunching under my boots in a rhythm that felt normal again, the porch light casting a steady glow across the yard, and when I reached the door, I paused for a second, looking back one last time at the slope where the cellar sat, quiet and still, just another part of the land as far as anyone else would ever see. Tomorrow, there would be questions, conversations, maybe even attempts to reshape what had happened into something else, something more convenient. But those were things that would unfold on their own, handled in places that did not change what I already knew. Some things do not need to be argued to be true. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me with a soft click, and the house settled around me the same way it always had, steady, familiar, unchanged, and for the first time since that sound woke me earlier, everything felt exactly where it belonged. And out there, beneath the quiet earth, the cellar stayed exactly what it had always been.